we're really delighted to have hosted so much enthusiasm, to have such an amazing lineup of judges and speakers for this. It's been a really inspiring process to conceive of this and to kind of shepherd it through the year of organizing that it took. And we're really gratified that you came to stake your claim to seek after the big prize. So I wanted to open and just offer a brief thought why we're doing this. So imagine you're Deborah Spalding, Deputy CIO of the State of Connecticut's pension fund. So you have a lot of responsibility resting on your shoulders. You're looking at your portfolio. Imagine you learned there will be a global tax on carbon. It's going to be $40 a ton. You're looking at your portfolio. You just learned this. The question for future fund managers is, how well should you have prepared for that moment? How much will it affect your portfolio? How should you have prepared for that moment? Very pragmatic kind of financial questions. But there's also another gesture that this competition is coming from, and this competition is really also about feelings. It's about a moral intuition that we all have, that we have some duty to future generations and to people we don't know across the world. And so there's tangled and confusing questions about when that moral intuition should come into our professional lives, how it should come into our professional lives, if and where it's appropriate. So it's very pragmatic, and it's also very idealistic, and we're merging the two here. And we're asking teams to do that. So we're expecting a very wide range. We're expecting teams to take a very pragmatic look at this and say, this is the portfolio analysis. I'm sure some teams probably have done that. And we're also expecting teams to say, this is the big picture. Let us help you think about this in the right way. And all of that is okay, and the judges know that. So just to ease some teams' minds. It's also, the case is really about a very long-term financial perspective. So rather than short-term trading, we're asking people to take, the institution is hundreds of years, looking hundreds of years in the future, take that perspective as a financial manager. And we're lucky also to have a leading thinker in the history, in the long-term view of finance. So I thank you, and I'm also going to welcome our Yale's leading thinker in financial history, and our guru, William Getzman, who also made this talk.
Okay, thank you for the plug on the talk. I really appreciate it.
They're purchasable.
Well, I'd like to also welcome you to Yale. I'm a finance professor at the School of Management, and I just want to give you a little bit of context about Yale and how we do things here. The raw cases which you all have engaged with are the foundation of the school's educational process, and the idea behind them is that no single perspective on a problem is really going to get you to the best solution. So the concept is the cases require you to think from different frameworks, and that's the perfect way to think about the problem that you all have attacked in this competition, because on the one hand there is a very clear environmental framework that has, as Yogi says, real implications, not just moral, but implications about risk and society. And then on the other side, of course, is the very real institutional problem of endowment management and supporting organizations with really noble goals as well. So those perspectives, it's not clear how you're going to, in your cases, bring those together, but this is really a nice situation where there's no clear one right answer that we can all jump to. This is also a very interesting tradition at the School of Management, which is that students here have embraced this case approach, and unbeknownst to the faculty, students began to have case competitions, write their own cases, and develop them, and hold national case competitions using this raw case format. The faculty are just along for the ride on this, and it's really gratifying that our students have embraced this as their own means of engaging with interesting issues and questions. The thing I'd like to do is really first to congratulate and thank all the volunteers that made this happen at Yale. I mean, I've met with some of you from time to time, but it's just amazing to see how you galvanized interest and really made this happen. Of course, really want to single out Yoni Jonathan Landau and Logan Yanov-Guk, both of them who I've had a good chance to work with over the course of the last few months and really see their initiative and their vision and persistence in making this not just a broad case about low carbon, but about really engaging in the institutional challenges that this case brings up. We all really have to thank also Jan Elias, who is in charge of our case writing team here at SOM, and he just has done a remarkable job in assisting with the development of this case, and again, making sure that it has the reality of endowment management behind it. That wouldn't have been possible without Common Fund, which is an organization that really has a serious interest in this. I can say that because I spent 12 years on the board of Common Fund and really understood their moral and ethical commitment to thinking about what the right thing to do is. And also for their willingness to provide us access and really knowledge about how investment management takes place in the context today, again, for endowments. With that, I'm going to introduce John Griswold. John's a co-author of mine. We have written a paper about endowments, history of endowments, but also John is the head of the Common Fund Foundation, the institute that does education about and for endowments. And he's got a long-term interest in how endowments work. So with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Will. Just a couple of words. Thanks to Jonathan and Logan for all their hard work, an astonishing amount of work in a short period of time. We're pleased to be helping to sponsor this. Really, as Will said, as part of our work. Just in July, this last July, we were across the hall in a very similar classroom. Each year we give a thing called we organize a thing called the Endowment Institute, and Will is one of our co-directors of that. And Geert Rowenhorst also is part of that faculty. We like to inform, teach, educate, orient institutional investors from the nonprofit space. That's our mission in life, has been for over 40 years. We're delighted to help with this program because we think it advances that cause. We think it generates potentially life-changing or economically significant solutions to problems that face really mankind. I think the point being made by Will and Logan and Jonathan is this is a very interesting way of approaching a solution through a case method. I think all of you have been working with cases for a long time. You know that there are no absolute solutions, as Jonathan said. But in fact, they are a means of getting tremendous ideas to bubble up, and we're interested in that, as we always are with the problems of investing itself. So thank you for the opportunity, all of you. Thanks, Will, and we'll be around for the rest of the day.
Thanks, John. It's really exciting to be here. Yoni and I have been working on this case competition for actually about a year now, so to see the culmination of this effort and just all of the diversity of teams and individuals that have come to Yale for this, it's just tremendously exciting. So It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Kenneth Gillingham to kick us off for the day. One of the reasons I'm really excited about his talk is because he really can provide a broad economic perspective on the issue of climate change. Climate change really is a systemic risk that we're facing in investing, and so we have to think really broadly across all sectors of the economy when we think about this issue, and I think his background really lends itself well to this broad perspective. So with that, Dr. Gillingham is an assistant professor of economics here at Yale. He holds appointments at the School of Forestry and Environmental Studies, Department of Economics, and School of Management. His research interests are broad. They lie at the intersection of environmental and energy economics, public economics, transportation economics, and energy and climate policy modeling. Obviously, he's got broad interdisciplinary background. He's received his PhD in management science and engineering from Stanford University, as well as an MS in statistics and an MS in management science from Stanford. His undergraduate degree is from Dartmouth, and he's also currently working on a really relevant research project looking at IPCC projections and looking at the uncertainty associated with those projections and how they could impact a lot of these climate risk efforts. So without further ado, Kenneth Gillingham, thank you. This event is also being live streamed, so if you have any questions, please press the button and make sure it's green before you speak.
Am I all set with? Great. Thank you very much, Logan. A huge thanks should go to both Logan and Jonathan. They've done an amazing job, and their team of students who've helped support them in putting this workshop together this day. There's amazing seeing faces from all over the country. Thank you all for coming as well. I'm really pleased to be here to give a short overview of climate change economics as it applies to low carbon investing. So as was already mentioned, I do work in my own research quite a bit on climate change economics. This is a massive topic. There's so much that you can talk about here. There's no way that I could even begin to scratch the surface in 15 minutes, yet I'm going to try. I'm going to talk about opportunities and challenges. I'm going to begin by framing the problem. The problem. The problem is clear. There's a very, very clear correlation. It starts at the science. This is why I talk very often with scientists and try and understand how climate scientists, how the atmosphere is changing over time, and what does that really mean. You can see the correlation pretty clear. This is going way back in history. We're going 800,000 years ago. And you just look and see whenever there was a major volcanic event, there'll be a skyrocketing increase pulse of CO2, and temperatures increase. Now, this is just the Antarctic temperature, but you could look at temperatures in a variety of different ways. Of course, what's very relevant to us today is up here at the very top, where fossil fuel burning is leading to much more emissions. 2014, we hit 400 parts per million. That's why we're here today. When you zoom in more recently and look at how temperatures have changed over the past over 100 years, since 1850 to 2013, there's a very, very clear trend. And if you compare this to much further back, it really is quite remarkable. You can put confidence intervals around it. It's very clear to us that since 1850, since the rise of the Industrial Revolution and fossil fuel emissions have occurred, temperatures have begun increasing. And it's clear, too, that there are sinks in the atmosphere and in the oceans. So in sinks in the oceans that have been taking up much of that CO2. Eventually, they will become saturated, exacerbating the issue. So that's why we're all here. There's no need for me to go on much more on the science. But I do want to talk about projections and what this means, because now we're moving towards what this is going to actually mean in terms of risks. In terms of US temperatures, these are projections that come out of the IPCC. The top red line on the left-hand side is the representative concentration pathway. So in the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, they have different pathways in which they imagine the world will reduce emissions by different amounts. The top red one is RCP 8.5. That means very little change, almost business as usual, potentially business as usual. Then there's a pathway RCP 6.0. That would be some changes. RCP 4.5, RCP 2.6. Dramatic changes. The bottom green line there. These obviously all have some uncertainty bounds around them that are listed here based on the scenarios that they've run. There's a likely range around each of them. So one of the themes in climate change economics, and even in climate change in general, is understanding uncertainty and taking that into account in decisions. So this is why it's really a risk problem. But as we can see here, if you are allowing temperatures, if there's very little mitigation, the RCP 8.5 shows temperatures dramatically increasing by 2100. Now there's this huge gap between the two, and much of that gap is going to relate to what policies are put in place. Which brings me to another important point, that it looks like policies will be being put in place, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But what effect would this have? So let's look at the 8.5. This is if no policies or dramatic policies are put in place. This is just the effect immediately on summer temperatures. We're still in the science world here. You can look here between 1981 and 2010. This is the daily average summer temperatures in degrees Fahrenheit recently. You see 110 at the top, there you're getting really hot, and you see much cooler down there. So those desert areas around the Mojave Desert are really hot. Now imagine we move to a world not too far in the future, within many of our lifespans, hopefully within my lifespan, 2040 to 2059. We're talking much hotter summers. These are the daily average temperatures all through here. Look at the Mojave Desert. Think about how hot it is there. You've been to Death Valley before. We're moving some of those. Now, obviously, it's not going to be as hot as Death Valley in Atlanta, but you are moving up temperatures pretty dramatically. These are coming from really well-defined science. This is coming from global climate models, and this was put together by a great group of scientists, and I'll talk about that in a moment. So we have, while there are wide uncertainty bounds around each of these things, we have a pretty good sense that this is the direction we're moving. And the science is becoming more and more clear as we look over time. So what does this mean? This is where it comes in. How many people here have heard of the Risky Business Report? Excellent. You guys pay attention and read the news. The Risky Business Report, put together by some eminent business people, Michael Bloomberg, who's also a politician, Hank Paulson, the former Treasury Secretary, Tom Steyer, hedge fund manager. On this committee involved a whole series of other eminent folks. We had people like George Shultz and Robert Rubin, both Treasury Secretaries. George Shultz also was CEO and many other things. We had the CEO of Cargill. You have a variety of people involved in this. And so I highly encourage you actually to go to this website. It's quite interesting. They got a team of scientists together, many of whom I'm friends with, who I know, and economists, to put together a really close, careful look at the economic risks of climate change. By region in the US, you can actually click on the regions and see what the different risks would be. I'm not going to go into all the details, but I'll talk about a few of these. First of all, there's sea level rise. As you increase temperatures, you're going to melt some of the poles, melt our glaciers, and sea level could rise. And that 8.5, that red line that I showed before, is the RCP 8.5 scenario if nothing is done. That's pretty dramatic. The sea level rise that we would see by the end, hopefully you can read that, by 2090, brings us up from the baseline 2.5 feet on average. Think about how many places, how many homes on the Connecticut coast, for those of you who are from this area, are not much more than 2.5 feet. And then this applies to surges. So when storm surges from hurricanes happen, we'll have real difficulties. One of my colleagues, Robert Mendelson, has a house right in Stony Creek. He's very worried about this. His house is right above, maybe 4, 5, 6 feet. He's already thinking about saving sandbags and putting them in his backyard. It's going to become a real issue. You can see this along the coastlines on the bottom, the local sea level rise in 2100, as put together by the group of scientists in this risky business report. You see all along, in many of the most populated areas in the United States, certainly Florida is a major issue, but all along, Connecticut's no exception there, but all along the West Coast as well, Texas, all these coastal areas where there are high groups of population, we have real worries. So we are playing in risky business. Or as Bill Nordhaus, my colleague, talks, we're rolling the dice. There's a lot at stake here. Let me bring in one other thing, the effect on agriculture. So I mentioned that the Risky Business Report had the CEO of Cargill, Greg Page is his name, on their report. They're very concerned. They're really thinking about what this is going to mean. The change in yields, this is 2020 to 2039. We're not talking very far in the future here. Already the change in yields in percentage terms, the leftist percentage terms, could be quite dramatic under an RCP, so Representative Concentration Pathways, pathway. The relative change in yields. So in the middle, you'll see all these change in yields in areas that are the breadbasket of the United States. Obviously, it's not just the coasts that are going to be affected. It's many other places as well. Agriculture, ski resorts are others. That's one that I'm concerned about. But these are real issues. We are rolling the dice. What does this mean? It means there are opportunities. There are opportunities, especially when it comes to low carbon investing and in terms of pathways in the future for your own careers. This just happened. I'm sure many of you have seen pictures just like this. President Obama was speaking with Prime Minister of China about plans and goals to reduce emissions. The Chinese emissions are supposed to peak in 2030 and decline after this. I always wondered why one's drinking red and one's drinking white. That's an aside. The pledges by the US and China, this is from the New York Times. The emissions goals. Mr. Xi said his country would curtail carbon dioxide emissions, so they're going to peak around 2030. Obama pledged the United States would cut emissions by at least 26% from 2005 levels by 2025. And it's a goal in line with other targets he'd promised. So these are emissions from what we've been looking at in the past few years. China's emissions have skyrocketed. They've actually surpassed the United States. And you can see the United States emissions. What are the pledges? China's pledge is a plan to have carbon dioxide peak around 2030. So we'll see what that means. That could still be quite high. But it still means dramatic changes to how China is using their energy system. And Obama's pledge to China is to cut emissions by 26% to 28% from 2005 levels by 2025. And then Obama has a larger target down here by 2050. What's it going to take to do this? So in the IPCC, they actually ran a whole set of scenarios. These are the types of things that I play and work in. About the greenhouse gas concentration pathways. These are from the latest IPCC Fifth Assessment Report, Working Group number 3. That's what all those gibberish down in the corner mean. So what you see there is 8.5 in the business as usual is dramatically different than the 2.6. Now the 2.6 would be a scenario where we implement dramatic changes in our energy system to reduce them. At the bottom there, there's a lot there. But what we're looking at is what it would take to bring us down to even the 430. So we can look at the right-hand one. How much would we have to upscale our low-carbon energy supply? It's a very significant upscaling. And that means moving away from heavily fossil fuel-intensive fuels. So if we're going to meet these targets, there's going to be a dramatic shift in the energy system. This is an opportunity. This is something to think about when you're thinking about investments. What will it take? Sure, wind, solar, carbon sequestration, all of these play prominently in the models. But there's more to it than even these. You all know about these technologies, I assume. But there are actually a variety of opportunities and clever ways. There's demand-side management. I was just down in Washington, D.C. yesterday, actually, for the Department of Energy's quadrennial technology review expert panel to provide input into that quadrennial technology review. Certainly we were talking about solar. Certainly we were talking about wind. But we were also talking about a whole variety, a suite of other technologies, many in niche fields that you wouldn't have thought of initially. These are connected cars. People may have heard about these. There's the Google autonomous car, but they're also connected cars. These connected cars provide ways to not only increase safety, but also reduce emissions, keeping speeds more steady, making sure that you don't have to accelerate quite as much, because that's where the fuel economy drop often is in behavior. Beyond connected cars, there are a variety of opportunities on the demand side in energy efficiency in other areas. O-Power is a company that receives about a 2% reduction in electricity use simply by adding on a little component to your electricity bill comparing you to your neighbors. Many of you have heard of this. There are a variety of opportunities, even outside of the classic renewable energy technologies. But there are challenges. There's considerable physical uncertainty. So there are opportunities I should mention as well on the side. We said sea level might be rising. There will be major changes in the energy system. So there are opportunities both on the mitigation side and on the damages side as we look forward into these ideas that some of the areas along the coast will change. Some of the agriculture is going to need new technologies. But there are challenges. We don't know exactly. We know very, very strongly that things are happening. These are probability density functions. So these are distributions of climate sensitivity. They tell us that if you double carbon dioxide, how much will the equilibrium mean surface temperature change? You see some of these are quite different than others. So at the far right, you see those are situations where we're having dramatic changes very quickly is really what's going to be going on, because they're fat tails. Often people may have heard of fat tails. But there's a wide variation in what's going to be happening. And there's considerable regulatory uncertainty. So how will we meet these targets? We saw President Obama speaking to the Prime Minister of China. How will these targets be met? And will we meet these targets is another question. So in any investing situation, there's clear decision-making under uncertainty. That's why we have portfolios. This is another place where there's risks all along the way, and you have to think carefully about these risks. Use your knowledge and think about what's going to be happening into the future. I bring this up. You may not be able to read it entirely. This is this is the Kyoto Protocol, in which we had many countries set targets about reductions of carbon dioxide emissions. And we see the changes in 2000 to 2009 relative to the targets. The top one is Australia. Their target was the top bar. The black bar is what actually happened. They didn't even come close. So there have been situations in the past where people have committed to targets and not even come close. Some of the few countries that actually did come closer or exceeded their targets tended to be countries where they dramatically reduced their heavy industry. So parts of Russia, Hungary, and other places along those lines. So there are challenges. There's considerable regulatory uncertainty. So I'm going to finish up here. Climate change is about risks. It's about mitigation risk. Are there going to be stranded assets as we move forward? Are there new markets to explore? And it's about adaptation and damages. It's about the risk to the shoreline communities. It's about the risk to Cargill and their agricultural investments. Are there stranded assets in those areas? Are there needs for new technologies, say in agriculture and other areas? Fundamentally, low-carbon investing is about taking into account these risks, understanding them, exploiting them. And with that, I hope you all have a fantastic day thinking about these risks and thinking about opportunities and the challenges involved. So, thank you very much.
Thank you. We'll take any questions that anyone has. Yes.
Hi, Judah Zubola from Johnson School as well. Just a quick question. Can you talk us through some of those different scenarios in terms of the growth and demographic assumptions that are being made and help us understand some of the sensitivity around that, right? Because sitting in 2007, thinking the world was going to grow a certain way, targets that may have looked ambitious look less ambitious when you don't grow as fast.
That's exactly right. That's a great question. So these targets were actually devised using a whole series of different scenarios. They're representative scenarios about how you think the world might evolve, is what is underpinning each of these. They actually had a separate model using each of these and coming up with a consistent set of scenarios. Those scenarios are not based on clear probability distributions on how population is going to change, how economic growth is going to change. That is actually an area of my own research, which we hope is going to inform the next IPCC. So I would say they don't do a full job of that. And so in a sense, the IPCC is giving you half the picture on uncertainty. They have those bars around there. Those bars are some scenarios that they said, oh, these seem reasonable about a high population scenario. So the high part of those bars would be, by bars I mean the gray areas around each. The high part is their take on a reasonable high population, high GDP growth scenario. Their lower part is a reasonable low GDP, low population growth scenario. But those are not based on any probability distributions. Those are based on modelers' insight. We can do better than that. And that's what we're working on in the academic community, my work with Bill Nordhaus and others, to try and actually have probability distributions that are taken from experts or from the very best sources we can find that allow us to understand those better. The bottom line is that you're exactly right. It's going to be much harder to meet some of these lower scenarios, the RCP 4.5, in a world with high economic growth and high population growth.
Sorry. If I could just follow up. I want to make sure I'm reading this correctly, because as I look at that graph, it seems like the worst case scenarios are actually much more, because there's a wider band of uncertainty around them, they're much more sensitive to your demographic and growth assumptions.
That is exactly the right interpretation. Yes.
Any other questions?
I've got to hold on to it. All right.
Yes, please hold down the button.
Hold down the button. Sean Poole with the Macomb School of Business. Thank you. Very cool to see these probability distributions on. I see a lot of this is on the physical probability distributions of what's the uncertainty around how carbon drives temperatures. I would love if you could comment on if to the degree that it's out there, what kinds of modeling we have around per degree warming increase, what the economic damage would be, and what's the sort of standard deviation on that, and what those probability distributions look like, or if folks have done that.
That is an area of active research. There's a great deal of research on damages and how to translate an increase in CO2, a change in temperature, to damages. Now that research is all though done, sector by sector, focusing on agriculture in the US, focusing on agriculture in Europe. It's not done in a broad brush. So even in the risky business report, there's a very, very nice table in that report that summarizes our knowledge and what we know. There's no single probability distribution function for me to point you to there. If there was, it definitely would have made it into this talk. In fact, what's actually fascinating is that there's still great unknowns. That some of the key areas where we think that there are going to be major impacts, for example, agriculture in some developing countries. There's very little work yet in those areas. So that's one of the important parts about this risky business report, is that we know a great deal about impacts on the US and in certain sectors, but we're not yet at the point where we can bring it all together. Yet all of it is pointing in the same direction. And that's really one of the main points about that report, as well as my own work and a variety of other people's work, that all of it's pointing in the same direction. You can probably guess and infer already, but until we have the rigorous numbers, you want to be cautious about doing that. And that when you look at that table in that risky business report, there's some really interesting points about key areas where we just don't quite know, and they actually provide a bar about how confident we are in each of these areas. So I highly recommend you look at that to get a sense about how to translate, given the best knowledge we have today, the temperature change to damages and impacts.
Hi there. Thanks for your compelling evidence. Two things. One, I do think there's a report of the estimate of the top 30 climate risks by region, including agricultural and the like, so that's at least a place to start. Mm-hmm. My second question is around This is great scientific evidence for analytical and numbers-driven people, like many of us in the room. But what about the emotionally driven people? How do we use this type of evidence to help sway them?
Well, you certainly don't want to show PDFs. So that gets into a variety of other issues, that some of which I may not be the best person to discuss. But when you really want to get into communicating science, it's quite challenging, and much of it has to do with finding anecdotes, finding ways to relate to people. And for climate change, it's tough, because it's this long-term problem that you can't attribute, or people are getting better at attributing, but it's difficult to attribute any one given event to climate change. But boy, we're getting better at it, and boy, we know that we're seeing more of these events. And that's very important. And so I feel that what's often been the most effective is showing events that people can relate to, Hurricane Sandy, if you will, and pointing out those events and saying, how many more Hurricane Sandys do you want? And thinking carefully about that. Thinking carefully about farmers in the Midwest and saying, you just had a drought year. How many more drought years do you want? And really pointing to this fact that, being careful to recognize the science there is uncertainty. We don't know usually we don't know any one given event, although as I said, we can show probabilities increase. But by pointing to events in any way and saying that this is going to be more likely, and the evidence for that is strong.
Good morning, Bruce Kahn from Sustainable Insight Capital Management. So if you take the top 10 indicators of climate change, sea level rise, acidification, top 10 things that you can look at, how do you connect that to asset pricing? So, and has there been any work on that? So, I mean, it's one thing to talk about all these scenarios. It's another thing to say, well, what are the boundaries of pricing in terms of assets, and not just physical assets, but also financial assets?
That's a great question. That question is at the border of my knowledge. I can give you a few points towards that. So one of which is there's very clear evidence so there's a very nice study that a friend of mine, Derek Lemoyne, has done that shows the difference in stock prices based on expectations that the Waxman-Markey bill was going to go through. So that's on the mitigation side. You were asking about the damages side, to be clear. But on the mitigation side, there was a clear change in coal company stock prices as soon as it was very clear that Waxman-Markey was not going to go through. And that happened almost overnight in that case, due to a whole variety of situations. I could tell the story. It's a great story. But almost overnight, expectations changed about the probability that it was actually going to go through. There was immediate capitalization in asset prices. So on the mitigation side, people are paying attention. Now, are they paying attention as much as they should be? That's tough to know. On the damages side, these are long-run problems, and expectations are changing over time. And expectations determine these prices. So the degree to which they're capitalized is tough to fully disentangle at any one given point due to changes in expectations. What we can look at are events that change expectations. So Hurricane Sandy and things along those lines. Are those capitalized? I can't fully answer that question. I think they are to some degree, but perhaps not as much as you might imagine.
I'm Greg Larkin with Bloomberg. I guess my question is that I think for many investors anyway, there's a very strong fear that if you were to, for example, take the MSCI world and filter out all of the carbon intensive, say you structure that portfolio so that it's low carbon or climate change hedged, for lack of a better word. And I think for many investors, the concern would be is how much money are you leaving on the table if the only time you realize those investments are very small events like the one that you just mentioned? Does that mean that you underperform the market and see capital flight from asset owners in the process of waiting for sort of this huge perfect storm, which seems credible, but very difficult to time and punctuated by a bunch of small events while the world sort of goes on with a different kind of economic equilibrium? How do you address that, and how do you, structure a fund or structure an investment strategy around that? That's a big question. But,
That is a big question, and that's what we're here to talk about today.
Did you time that?
Do we have time for?
Yeah, we have time to. This will probably be the last question.
Okay, I think that's a great question. I think it's about incorporating the risks, thinking through. I think it's about taking a long-run perspective. If you're taking a short-run perspective, then you have to really pay attention to what regulations are going in. The damages are longer run. I mean, they will come in over time. You may have more Sandys, if you will, but it's a longer-term issue. And so if you're taking a longer-term perspective, you might actually underperform at the beginning. But you are taking a longer-term perspective, and you are recognizing these inherent risks in your portfolio in a way that others might not be. And so the question is the world going to do something about it on the mitigation side? There's that regulatory risk. I think they will. I think it's a matter of time. But it is a matter of time, and timing that right will depend on how much you might underperform the market. There are also opportunities, though, in these new markets that I'm referring to, in which taking advantage of those opportunities may provide clever ways to overperform the market. And so paying attention to these, looking at the regulatory structure, looking at where the trends are heading, I feel like can be a very valuable way to take advantage of these risks and exploit these risks for improving your returns. But that's, again, a topic for this case competition.
Great, thank you so much, everyone, for your questions. I'm going to hand it over to Wendy now to let the teams know where to head to the next room. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Kenneth. So do you guys all have Guidebook right now? How many have it? So basically, it's an app that you could download. Because it's low carbon, we don't want to give agenda to everyone and print more. So if you use Guidebook, you'll see there is a